the most important thing to remember with President Joe Biden is that he is part of the Barack Obama team. He was vice president for two of Barack Obama's terms in office, and therefore his very cautious approach to international relations is an outgrowth of that. And let's remember that Obama has a very bad record on international relations. Georgia was invaded by Russia in 2008. Two territories, South Ossetia and Abkhazia, were de facto annexed by Russia at that time. In 2009, 2009, there were no American or Western sanctions against Russia, and Barack Obama became U.S. president and launched a reset to improve relations with Russia. So many people believe that this was just the beginning of the West sending really misplaced signals to Russia that they can do what the hell they want. And then you had Syria from about 2011, 2012, uprising, civil war, however you want to call it. Russia comes in to support the mass murderer Assad, the ruler of Syria, in 2015. Assad is using chemical warfare and other forms of criminal ways of killing his people and protesters. Barack Obama says that's a red line, don't cross it because we'll get angry. Well, the Syrians did cross the red line. Barack Obama did sweet FA. And that was another signal. 2014, Russia invades and annexes Crimea. Barack Obama tells the Ukrainian leaders, then the Euromaidan revolutionaries who would come to power, that you should not resist this invasion. This is the advice sent from Washington to Ukraine. Don't try to resist the little green men coming into Crimea to annex Crimea. And for the next following kind of 8 years, President Petro Poroshenko is advised by Western governments, not only the US, but France, Germany, elsewhere, to forget about Crimea. You've lost it. Crimea is gone forever. Don't even bother. And Crimea was never included in the two Minsk agreements signed in 2014. So this is the background. And also in 2014, let's not forget that the US and Britain, then under Prime Minister David Cameron, both betrayed Ukraine in the sense of ignoring their commitments to support Ukraine under the Budapest Memorandum signed in 1994, where Ukraine gave up the world's third largest nuclear weapon arsenal in return for security assurance. Both Obama and Cameron ignored that in 2014. So Biden is a product or an outgrowth of that. And throughout that period of time, from 2014-16 onwards, right through to the full-scale invasion of 2022, you had first Trump and then Biden, not really doing much about Russian military aggression. Biden comes to power in 2020. He refuses. The U.S. refuses to send military assistance to Ukraine, even though in 2021, U.S. intelligence keeps telling everybody, the Europeans and the Ukrainians, when the Russians are going to invade. They give the precise date, precise hour. They've obviously collected incredible intelligence. This is the first time this kind of intelligence is made public. And even though they knew that Russia was going to launch this mass full-scale invasion, which Zelensky at the time refused to believe, they did not send weapons to Ukraine because they believed Ukraine would be quickly defeated, and then the only thing to give Ukraine is weapons for using guerrilla warfare. Biden also, when he became president, he cancelled sanctions against Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline from Russia to Germany, which had been imposed by Donald Trump. So in many ways, actually, Biden and Obama were worse than Donald Trump, if that's possible. Because Trump did actually send some weapons, at least. He didn't veto the sending of weapons when he was president, whereas Obama did. So that's the kind of background to Biden's cautionary approach. And therefore, I'm not that surprised. I don't like it. The kind of larger weapons beyond just using guerrilla warfare only began to arrive in Ukraine from about April 2022. And that was because by April of 2022, Ukraine had defeated the Russian army in the Kiev region. The Russians pulled out of the Kiev area. Their goal of taking Kiev in 3 days has obviously not happened, and therefore Western governments, including the US, recognized that Ukraine was not going to fall quickly, and therefore they began sending weapons, but they began sending weapons very slowly. Before I go on to that, it's worth thinking of a bit of a deja vu here. Not everybody who's listening and watching this will remember, but I certainly do, 1990-91. We had the same kind of feelings then, because then President Bush also had this inadequate fear of escalation then as well. Then the fear was that the USSR was about to collapse. You'd have a kind of chaos in a country, in a superpower, where there were lots of nuclear weapons. And so, although the US had been working for 40 or 50 years to try and destroy the Soviet Union by supporting emigre groups and other ways, dissidents and stuff like, when it was about to happen in 1990-91, the US started to panic. This was the background to President Bush coming to Kiev on August 1st, 1991, giving a speech to the Ukrainian parliament, which then became nicknamed Chicken Kiev speech, where he told Ukrainians not to go for some, what he called crazy nationalism for independence. Ukrainians politely listened and, of course, ignored him. Three weeks later, they declared independence. So the same kind of fear of escalation happened under Bush, Bush Senior, as has been happening under Biden. So weapons start coming to Ukraine in April of 2022. Bigger weapons, not just javelins, NLAWs, Stingers, to be used in kind of guerrilla warfare. But very slowly. I mean, you know, the biggest joke was the Germans offering 5,000 helmets. That was their only thing that they were going to supply at the beginning of this war. But at the very least, there was a different response to 2014. In 2014, the West didn't do anything. Ukraine was alone in fighting Russia, and it was actually trying to even restrain Ukraine. By 2022, at least, Ukraine had an army, because in 2014, Ukraine did not have an army. It was gutted by previous presidents, particularly under Yanukovych. By 2022, after 5 years of Poroshenko as president, Ukraine had rebuilt an army. So at least they had something to fight back with. And plus, you know, civic movement, volunteer movement, and territorial defense. But these weapons began to flow at what I would call in a drip fashion. And I think the way to understand this is to look at the countries in the West as divided into two groups. You have one group which I would call the hawks, and these would be the British, the four Scandinavian countries, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Finland, 3 Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and the Czech Republic, and Romania. Sorry, Romania as well. Those countries openly say they want Ukraine's military victory and Russia's military defeat. They openly call for this. And for them, there was no question of drip feeding weapons. They provided as much as they could straight away. There were other countries, like particularly Germany, France, and the US, which were more moderate, which supplied weapons only in a drip fashion. They were very scared of a potential Russian military defeat. So you already have, and you still have to some degree, these two groups of countries. What's changed is that France became more hawkish under Macron in 2023 and this year, at least up until the elections. But since the elections, Macron has become very quiet in the elections in France. So you have Biden on the one hand, which of course is the main supplier of weapons in the Western coalition, and German Chancellor Scholz, who's hiding behind the back of Biden. And both of those countries have this fixation and paranoia about this fear of escalation, that if you push Russia too hard, if you cross some fake red lines, then there'll be some kind of nuclear war or nuclear escalation. And I think the biggest mistake here, which was made, and which historians will ponder on, is in the autumn of 2022. Because at that stage, Russia was very weak in Ukraine, and Russia could have been military defeated if the West had really given a big push to help Ukraine at that time. This was a time when Ukraine had routed and really severely humiliated Russian military in Kharkiv. They literally ran with their trousers around their ankles away from Kharkiv. They just couldn't see what was going on. It kind of resembles a bit of the current invasion of Russia, where the Russian troops are lost. They just don't know what's going on. If at that stage the West had given Ukraine, just everything, tanks, you name it, long-range missiles, Ukraine would have probably reached the Black Sea at that stage by the end of that year. They'd have just driven straight south from Kharkiv. They didn't, and the reason is very simple why they didn't. Putin began hyping up the threat of nuclear weapons. Putin began to panic, and that's when Biden and Scholz also began to panic, and so the equipment and training being sent to Ukraine became very slow. This was for about 8-9 months, and this allowed the Russians to solidify their conquest of southeast Ukraine. It allowed them to launch a major mobilization of troops, about 300,000. This mobilization then led to a lot of Russians, something like nearly 1 million Russians fled from Russia at that time to evade that mobilization. So they mobilized at least 300,000 troops. Before that, when they were defeated in Kharkiv, Russia only had its invasion force in Ukraine, which was about 170,000. And that could have been defeated. After that, Russia began mobilizing 300,000. They built 3 lines of fortifications. And they also laid tens of thousands, I don't know how many mines around those fortifications. This made it very difficult 8, 9, 10 months later, when Ukraine launched its offensive in June of last year, for Ukraine to be successful in that offensive. Not only had the Russians completely changed their posture in Ukraine with a far bigger army, 300, 400,000 as opposed to 170,000, but Ukraine had to go through minefields and fortifications without any air power. When Western armies train for this kind of offensive, they always have air power. Ukraine didn't have jets. The jets have only just started arriving from the West. So that very slow drip feed of military equipment was deliberate. The US in particular and Germany, two of the biggest suppliers of weapons to Ukraine, panicked after Kharkiv. They were afraid of this nuclear rhetoric coming out of Moscow, and they didn't want Ukraine to be successful on the field. So what this has led to is a situation where, in effect, Western countries do not have clear-cut goals as to what they want to see coming out of this war. And here the Trump camp in the US and the Republican camp have a point. What is the Biden administration's goal in supporting Ukraine? Because it's not clear. The Biden administration has never said in public they want Russia's military defeat. So what does that mean? It just means a never-ending war. You've also, I think, another thing which really peeved off the Ukrainians was American criticism of Ukrainian attacks against energy infrastructure inside Russia, which is, which everybody else talked about as saying, hold on, didn't we do that in Iraq, in Germany in World War II? So what the hypocrisy of not allowing Ukrainians? So it's been feeling like the Americans have forced the Ukrainians to fight this war with one arm up their back. Now the Ukrainians are hitri by their very nature, they're cunning. So they've of course got round this in various ways by building their own missiles, building their own military equipment. People forget, the Russians have forgotten that Ukraine was a major part of the Soviet military-industrial complex. And Dnipropetrovsk had the biggest nuclear weapons factory in the world. It employed 50,000 people at that time, Pivdenmash, in Russian Yuzhmash. So that combined with a very vibrant volunteer sector, civil society sector, investing in things like drone production, has meant Ukrainians have been able to build up their own military capacity separate to Western military aid coming to Ukraine. So Americans can maybe put an embargo on the use of their weapons inside Russia, but they can't do that with Ukrainian weapons. And so Ukraine has been hitting Russian targets up to 2,000, 3,000 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. I mean, just incredible, some of the ranges that they've been hitting, both military airfields, factories, and energy infrastructure so far out. The consequences of not having clear-cut goals for this war on the part of the Americans and the Germans in particular is that this is terrible for Ukraine, because a long war for Ukraine is not the best option. For Ukraine, the best option is a short war and a quick end to the war. You do not want this war to continue for a long time, as it would do with this kind of American policy, because that means Ukrainian economy will never be able to fully recover. It means continued social dislocation. It means that the 6 million refugees abroad will not come back. It means that you can't begin reconstruction inside the country. Continuous social problems, continued growth of numbers of Ukrainians with disabilities, handicapped because they were wounded in the war, more Ukrainians killed. So a long drawn out war is actually immoral, because it basically means the countries like the US prefer Ukrainians to continue to be killed rather than the war ending or the war coming, as it were, to NATO if Ukraine is defeated. And I think that is something that is why President Zelensky is trying to sort of speed up the conclusion of the war by taking the war inside Russia, so that the Russians come to understand. Because the problem we have is that most Russians are simply sticking their heads in the sand like ostriches. They're not opposed to the war and they're not for the war. Many of them just simply want to ignore it. They don't want to take responsibility, and by bringing the war to them in Russia, that shows them you can't stay passive, you can't stay aside from this war. But a major outcome of this as well is that it's going to be far more difficult for Ukraine to liberate occupied southeastern Ukraine. Why? Because now, I mean, back when it was Kharkiv in 2022, and in the September of that year when Ukraine was very successful, there were only 170,000 troops. Now, we don't know if this is true, but Vladimir Putin talks about upwards of 500,000 Russian troops. That's a huge number. That you're talking 3 times more. Usually in a military kind of campaign, to be successful, you want to have at least 3 times more troops than your opponent, which is the reason why Russia was not successful in 2022. 170,000 against 400,000 Ukrainians. Obviously, it was going to be not successful. They then expected Ukrainians to welcome these Russians as liberators, which of course was rubbish. Now you have 450 upwards of Russian troops. That's going to make it far more difficult for Ukraine to liberate those territories, and it's going to be a far more difficult slog. It's not going to be impossible, but it's made a lot of people in the West, I think, pessimistic at the idea that Ukraine will be able to regain back all of the territories that belonged to Ukraine before 2014. But we shall see. Another, I think, outcome of this cautious lack of fear of escalation approach is the whole question of NATO. You now have an unprecedented number of countries in NATO supporting Ukrainian membership. It's the highest ever. Something at least about something 80% maybe now of countries supporting NATO membership for Ukraine, including France. The 2 countries that continue to block it are Germany and the US. So before we go raise the question of the US being Ukraine's best friend in the West, no US president since President Bush, i.e. since 2009, has supported Ukrainian membership of NATO. So that's nearly 20 years. Obama, Trump, and Biden have all not supported Ukrainian membership of NATO. This is a mistake, and a very cynical mistake, because it continues to leave Ukraine in this gray zone, which is tempting for Russia to keep on attacking. If you want to quickly end this war, bring Ukraine into NATO. Yes, you'd only be able to bring in the part of Ukraine which is not occupied, of course, bring that part of Ukraine into NATO. But once that part which is not occupied is part of NATO, a member of NATO, then Russia will not stop, will not be willing to attack a NATO member. Keeping Ukraine outside NATO will continue this war forever, as it were. So I think the only way forward is to adopt the approach that they adopted after World War II. Then they brought West Germany into NATO, even though part of Germany was occupied by the Soviet Union, the GDR, the so-called Eastern Germany. But at least Western Germany was given security by being part of NATO, part of the EU. It could rebuild itself and build a democracy. Keeping Ukraine outside is going to be, I think, a fatal mistake. And I think that it's a way of prolonging the war. NATO keeps kind of jumping through various hoops to try to bring out this nice vocabulary and discourse to say, oh, Ukraine is about to join, or this. It's been doing this towards Ukraine. It's been, in effect, I think, lying about membership for Ukraine since at least 2008. And I think that is wrong. It's also wrong because Ukraine is now probably the most military experienced country in NATO. Ukraine outspends, I think, even the US in terms of military defense expenditure. So all of the experiences that Ukraine is gaining on the battlefield from this new type of warfare that we're seeing, this is all experience that when this war ends, Ukrainians are going to be going around everywhere as military advisors and training Western troops. So I think that there's a big mistake here, and I think if you want to have some kind of peace agreement, even a temporary peace agreement, the only way to stop this war reigniting again is to bring at least the 80% of Ukraine, which is not occupied by Russia, bring it inside NATO. And then we can have a temporary ceasefire maybe, and then we'll see how it goes. But allowing it to continue as it is now is allowing for a never-ending war, which is just suffering for Ukrainians. I think on a final thing we should talk about is just how this current Ukrainian invasion of Russia, which began 3-4 days ago, has completely ridiculed the concept of a Russian red line. Where are the nuclear weapons that are flying? Why is Russia not saying it's going to do something drastic after Russia was invaded for the first time since 1941? Why are we so afraid of these red line consequences with Russia when Ukraine just invaded Russia and Russia's doing nothing about it? So I think, if anything, one of the great outcomes of this current military intervention, Ukraine's special military operation inside Russia, is that this has finally debunked this whole exaggerated fear of escalation and red lines, and hopefully it will lead to an end to this drip policy, and Ukraine being given everything it needs to successfully defeat Russia and then quickly end the war. It's in the interests of Ukraine, it's in the interests of Western countries for this war to end quickly, and it will be good for Russia, because every time Russia has lost a war, whether it's Crimean War in the 19th century, the Russo-Japanese War in 1905, 1917, when its army collapsed on the Eastern Front, every time Russia has been militarily defeated, reformers come to power. Not extremists, reformers come to power. And there's no question that a military defeat in Ukraine would lead to the collapse of Vladimir Putin's regime. He could not survive that. That should be in the interests of the West, and it would be good for the Russian people as well. So on that note, let's keep our fingers crossed. Thank you.